So in this final video for skill classification and characteristics, we are looking at how to use the continuum to classify skill and justify where you have placed them on the continuum. This is a very popular exam question. Let's have a look at our first continuum, which was the open and closed continuum. So here we had on one end of the continuum our open skills, and on the other end we had our closed skills. I think you can probably appreciate when I asked you to do the task on the last video that it was quite difficult to sometimes choose a purely open skill or a purely highly organised skill, and that there was this continuum where the skill could fall anywhere between this point and this point. And you would be absolutely right to think that. So what we have to do for the AQA, A-level examination, is we may be given a skill, or we may need to come up with a skill ourselves, and we need to place it somewhere on this continuum and justify why we have placed it where we have. So let's have a look at the surfing picture, and let's place her on the continuum somewhere. If this is open and this is closed. So this is an unpredictable environment. This is adaptation of the skill that's required. This is a predictable environment and a repetition of exactly the same movements. Now, to stay on the surfboard, this lady will need to continuously adjust her position. She doesn't know where the waves are going, where they're coming from, how big they are, how fast they're moving. So there are frequent changes. However, once she's on the wave, there is some stability and some ability to be able to predict what's going to happen. So you could justify that you would pop it at about here on the continuum. It's certainly more towards the open end than the closed end, but you could justify that it isn't a completely open skill. Let's have a look at the ball rebounding unexpectedly. So the ball bounces on the floor, you're due to try to receive the ball, and it goes off in a different direction. You have to change your response. So it's unpredictable, but the ground hasn't changed. The ground has always been the same. It's just hit a little bump, so it's a bit unpredictable. Are there frequent changes? No, it doesn't change again, and I've just got to adapt my skill to it. Is it a predictable movement for me? I have to change the direction, but my response to trap the ball is still the same. So you could argue that in this situation, it's a little bit further down the continuum. Driving in golf would be our next one to justify on the continuum. The tee, the plastic tee that you put the ball on, that stays the same. That's at a height that you want, so it'll be the same height every time. Does your club change? No, you keep the same club for driving every time, and usually they're your clubs, so that doesn't change. The golf ball doesn't change. The movement of the golf ball doesn't change. It's stationary. So we would definitely say this is more at the closed end. Why is it not completely closed? Why would we not put it here? Well, we could argue that if you are hitting on a windy day, then there is some unpredictable environmental influences. So potentially for a golf drive, you could put it here. And you could then argue that putting in golf is a more closed skill even than driving in golf, because the wind doesn't affect that. So to recap, you potentially will be given some skills, or you may need to think of the skills themselves. You need to mark them physically on a continuum, and then you need to use these words up here and here to justify where you have placed them and why. Any skill will fall somewhere between these two ends of the open and closed continuum. This continuum works in exactly the same way, but we have gross skill and we have fine skill. Now, we looked at this darts player, and he certainly is using finer muscle groups than this netballer, who is using, you could argue, every muscle in the body. You would therefore say that this darts player is using fine skill, so will be closer to this end of the continuum. However, he was using his arm, he was using his shoulder, and you could argue there was some contraction in the waist here. But this part on his hand here is very small and fine skills. So if we're looking at the small, fine skills of his hand, then we would put him up here. If we were to justify that he was using his shoulder and his core, then we would move the cross a little bit further towards the gross end of the continuum. The gross end uses these big muscles and muscle groups. So a dive, when you're starting a swimming race, would certainly be up here because you are using pretty much every muscle in the body. Are you contracting that muscle, every muscle in the body, to the fullest extent? Probably not, so you could argue that it would be down from the very end. Running, you may argue in comparison to that, would be even lower towards the fine end because you are using your lower body to run. Your upper body is relatively stable. So for this next continuum, we looked at the pace of a skill and whether that was set by the person, the performer themselves, or externally. We looked at the recreational jogger, and we said that the jogger controls the pace of their skill and the time at which they start their skill. So we would say that the jogger would be placed on the continuum towards the self-paced end for those two reasons. This long jumper we would place lower down the continuum, and the reasons for that are the performer controls the pace of the skill until they are in the air, and they control the start time of the skill up to a certain point, but the judges will make them take their run up between a certain time to keep the competition in flow. But these are the reasons you can argue it would be lower down than a recreational jogger. The externally paced would be a good example is the sprint start, so they have no control over the initiation. That is all down to the gun, so you would certainly argue it's up to the externally paced. In terms of the execution of the skill, they've got to go as fast as they can. They're dictated to by other runners. So again, you would say this is externally paced. Surfing, as an example, is externally paced because you are dictated to by the waves. So moving on to our organisation of skill, we've got our highly organised skill that was hard to break down. And we've got our low organised skill that was easily broken down into those subroutines and practised separately. So we'll have the high organised skills here and the low organised skills here. So let's have a look at this person doing the somersault. A quick action, they're up in the air, they're rotating 360 and they're landing. We can't practice any of those subroutines separately. Is there any point in practicing the takeoff? No, really. Not really, sorry. You can't really practice the landing until you've practiced the rest of it. So we would then say because you can't split the takeoff, the action and the landing, you have to do them all together. We could argue that it is very highly organised. A low organised skill such as swimming, we could say is sometimes difficult to break down, but you can split the legs and the arms. So you can just practice the arms, you can just practice the legs, so therefore you could justify it being a little bit towards the lower end of the scale. So we move on to our simple and complex skills. I just want to point out again that the simple skills is not a skill that's easy to complete, and a complex skill is not a skill that's hard to complete. It's all about this brain power. It's about decision making and what we call information processing. Decision making and information processing. How much information we need to take into our brain, absorb, translate, and then find a response, an adequate response. So for a simple skill, there is none of that. There is no information processing. It's a habitual skill. It's something we've practiced time and time again, and it's automatic, you might say. So this high diver coming off the board will have practiced their routine, even using mental rehearsal, and will try to do exactly the same again and again and again. There are no decisions to be made once they have taken off the board. So during the skill, no decisions are made. We can then justify them being placed high up the continuum towards the simple end. For a complex skill, so those with lots of decisions that need to be made or information that needs to be processed, we can look at passing to a teammate in football. You're in possession of the ball. You're looking up to pass to a teammate. You've got to make the decision of which teammate, where are they, how fast are they travelling, where would they need the ball, what type of pass would you need, how much power, what time you're going to send it, and this is changing all of the time. So we would refer to this as a complex skill for those reasons. Returning a shot in tennis, you would say is a complex skill, but potentially not as complex as the football, because there's slightly less information to process and slightly fewer decisions to make. You would need to make a judgment on how fast the ball is travelling, the trajectory of the ball, where you anticipate it landing, and your response to that. So we would justify this being a little bit lower down the continuum. Our final classification for the discrete, serial and continuous skills is exactly the same in terms of what the continuum looks like. So we've got your discrete, your continuous, and in the middle your serial skills. Your discrete skill was someone doing an activity that was difficult to break down, those fast ballistic actions with a clear beginning and end. So diving into a swimming pool, doing a somersault, shooting in netball. I know where I start, I know where I finish. Shooting in netball, it varies a little bit because of the distance from the net and whether you've got a defender in front of you or not, but there is still a clear beginning and end, and that never changes. So it would be a discrete skill. A serial skill are those skills linked together like a gymnastics routine. In basketball, for example, you've got a layup skill, which is the approach and the takeoff, which you could say is serial. You would split those two things up to practice them. A better example would be the triple jump, where you've got the hop, the step and the jump. And even better, you've got your routines in gym and dance, where you do your handstand, to forward roll, etc. So you would put those on the serial. If I was going to do the triple jump example, you could say that it is slightly more discrete than the gymnastics routine. Continuous skill has no clear beginning and end. Often one part of the subroutine goes straight into the next part. And I mentioned pedalling before with the cycling. We can't really tell where it starts. We're not talking about the race. I just need to reiterate that point. We're not talking about the start of the race. We're talking about the skill itself. So you would put these up here. Now I have a task for you. I would like you please to write down all of the continuums, and I'd like you to write them down in this format. So you get a ruler and you draw your 6 continuums and you put the headings on each one here. So you've got your open and your closed, you've got your highly organised and your low organised, etc., until you've got all 6. Then I would like you to name your skill. And then I would like you to put crosses on your continuums. And underneath each cross, you are going to put a justification of why you have put your cross where you have. Please either handwrite this and pop it on the OneNote or do it straight onto the OneNote.